Liberal Party in the United Kingdom, because he was very conservative, and he was very, all right, we have to begin. Oh, no. Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to do a webinar with Mr. Charles Coulombe and Mr. Eric Robert Morse on monarchism in the USA. This is a very particular topic because we don't talk too much about monarchism in libertarian circles, but we do in poly-libertarian circles, which are way more conservative. So I would like to introduce myself and then introduce Mr. Coulombe and Mr. Morse. I am Hugo Stornayola Silva. I'm the Hispanic America correspondent for Navarra Confidencial and the host of Navarra Confidencial TV. Can you introduce yourself a little bit, Mr. Coulombe?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, golly. All right. Well, I'm Charles Coulombe. I'm a writer. I have a weekly podcast called Off the Menu. I write for the Catholic Herald in Britain, for Crisis Magazine, Catholicism.org in the United States. I've written for many other periodicals. I've got 15 books, I think, 16. Another one is coming out this coming month, The Life of Blessed Emperor Karl of Austria. Well, what else can I say? I've been around a long time. That's why my hair is white.
Thank you very much. All right. Can you introduce yourself, Mr. Morse, please?
Sure. Yeah, so I've been around quite a while as well. I'm a writer. I have about 9 books, so I'm catching up to Mr. Charles over here. 9 books, mostly on social sciences, economics, history, psychology, and I'm the editor, one of the editors of the Libertarian Catholic.
All right, thank you very much. So we're pretty much on the same page in here. We're among a group of Catholic thinkers, but I think that we are in different traditions of political thinking. Well, as far as I know that Mr. Coulombe is very studied in the branch of integralism and, well, of traditional Catholic political thinking. Can you tell us a little bit about what are your political beliefs?
Well, that would take a little while, wouldn't it? The first thing I have to emphasize is that I'm neither a philosopher nor a theologian, although I'm studying both currently, and have done so in the past. I'm an historian, and I'm not what you would call that much of an abstract thinker. What does interest me is what's worked and what hasn't. So, with that basis in mind, I would say that recently, and by recent I mean the past couple of years, I did my best to think about what the different Catholic political movements of the past, Carlism in Spain, Legitimism in France, Miguelismo in Portugal, and one could go on, what they all had in common. And this was what interested me. It's something that's not really apparent to Europeans because the differences, primarily national, are what they see first. But there are a lot of similarities. And I would say that traditional Catholic social thought, say prior to 1950, basically had 5 points in common. There are many different varieties. I'm wildly oversimplifying, and by the way, I'm very aware of that, but here it is. The first is the altar, and that is the place of Catholicism in a Catholic society. And that means basically that the Catholic faith determines the ground rules, you might say, that people keep or pretend to, is the source of authority. And that, by the way, is a very important concept we have lost sight of, the difference between authority and power. Authority is the right to say what ought to happen. Power is the ability to make it so. So your doctor has the authority to give you medicine, but he doesn't have the power to make you take it. And that's a very important distinction, as you'll see. So basically, the altar then, that's the obvious part. The second part is the throne, and that is the institution of monarchy. Now, one of the problems that people have, especially Americans, when they deal with the idea of monarchy, is that they think immediately of despotism, of what is called absolute monarchy. I say what is called because, in truth, we live under a regime today in most Western countries that's far more absolute, even than Henry VIII. Henry couldn't redefine marriage, and he certainly couldn't redefine the very nature of humanity. The regimes we live under can. So you might say we live under an absolute democracy. So there's nothing quite like absolutism when it's being done for and to you. Anyway, I digress. So the Catholic idea of monarchy was very, very different. And that's where the distinction between authority and power comes in. One of the important things to bear in mind about Catholic social thinking is that it was basically an attempt on the part of Catholics to deal with the political aspects of the French and subsequent revolutions and the Industrial Revolution, and to somehow bring the organic unity, which they conceived as characterizing the medieval achievement, in some sort of modern form into the present. Now, therefore, the idea of the monarch in that setup was not of an absolute monarch in the sense that he's imagined. Rather, it was something much more like the American president, only hereditary, and bound by the church, you see. His authority coming from the church, his responsibility being to his people and to the customs under which they were governed. It's important to bear in mind that one of the differences between the medieval state to which they were looking and the current arrangement we have now is that in days gone by, authority was concentrated in the altar and the throne, but power was extremely diffuse. That is to say, the guilds had some, the church had some, the lords had some, even the peasants had some. The king, a good king, was like an orchestra leader. With a bad king, you didn't get despotism, even though it could make life unpleasant for the people immediately around him. Now, you got anarchy. That's what you got with a bad king. You got the Wars of the Roses. So that then was their idea of the monarch, an executive monarch, like the president, was certainly with control over foreign policy and the military. But, and this lets us slide into the third point, what our ancestors would have called local liberties, what modern Catholic social theorists call subsidiarity. And that's the idea that society is best governed, oddly enough and paradoxically, given what I've said, from the bottom up. The king gives authority, but power comes up like so, in a, how do I put it, in a practical sense. That's why, again, looking back to the Middle Ages and also looking back to the demands of people like the Carlists for the fueros, and they're fighting the centralizing liberal monarchy in Spain, and same in Portugal and France and so on. They saw very clearly that provincial rights, local liberties, were absolutely essential for a healthy, organic state, which lets us slip into the fourth. We're almost at the end. To the fourth point, and that they would have called in the 19th century class collaboration. There were different words for it. People talked about different aspects. You heard things like guild socialism, distributism, solidarism, all that sort of thing. But they were all describing different aspects of the same idea, which is that the different social classes, again on the basis of the faith, bear in mind, none of this really works without the faith as a source of authority and so on. Without the faith, none of this stuff is even possible. And that's an important point to bear in mind. But with it, it's what we call solidarity in modern Catholic social thinking. The classes operating together for the good of the whole, the common good, all that stuff. And that brings us lastly to the fifth or fourth and a half point, because it's a very vague one. And that is the concept of the different nations under such a scheme being vaguely part of a greater whole. The Respublica Christiana, the Occident in French, the Abendland in German. In English, Christendom, I guess is what we would say. But again, it's not something quite as defined as, say, the United Nations or the European Union. So, in the abstract, then, those are my political beliefs. Now, how you apply them to a particular case, that's a whole other story. And as far as the United States go, they are an entirely different story for a very important reason. And that is, they are not only not Catholic, they were, when they were at their beginning, sort of several sorts of Protestant. We are now post-Protestant. And with us, and this is again, and then I'll bring it to a swift halt because I don't want to keep on talking forever. I'm capable of doing it, so feel free to step in and stop me. But the point is that the United States are, in their origin, were very, very peculiar, because when they were settled, the 13 first colonies, I'm not talking about the Catholic United States, I'm not talking about Florida, Louisiana, California, and New Mexico, all of which had very different dynamics, very similar to Catholic Europe back when they were under their own sort of governance. My own ancestors, of course, in Quebec, benefited very highly from the Quebec Act, which, of course, under the British, gave us our freedom, religion, and laws, as the Ulsterman song has it. But the 13 colonies were extremely varied within each other, within each colony, and from each other. They had very different ruling classes, they had very different ethnic makeups, they had very different religious establishments. The only thing they had in common prior to the revolution was the image of the king, who, in their setup, was very much the defender of Protestantism against the Catholic foes to north and south. Now, when the revolution came, and after it was over and the king was gotten rid of, they had to come up with an alternative, because there was no unifying factor. And what they ended up with was, within what it was very clever. They built upon the already existing moral consensus. The different kinds of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews all pretty much agreed the same sorts of things were right and wrong. And that moral sense became very, very important in terms of national unity. They had a sort of created religion of the country, where the Liberty Bell and the Constitution and all that became sacred objects, and in a sense, in themselves took the place of the king. And that civic religion was an extremely important part. It was very, very consciously created. It was an extremely important part of replacing the monarch and serving as the focus of national unity. Those two things really created the American identity. And as I say, they worked for a long time. But in the 1960s, the moral consensus shattered. I remember. And the religion of the country we see dying before our very eyes. How does one react to that? How does one deal with that? Well, ultimately, I would argue that there are no political answers to it, no strictly political. The only answer I see, ultimately, is the conversion of the country. That, or as Orestes Bronson said way back in 1842, in an essay I highly recommend called Catholicity Necessary for Popular Liberty, I don't see how the country will remain in its current state. So, I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, thank you, Charles. All right, I'll go with you, Eric, now. you are a very particular brand of libertarian, because you are proud to call yourself a libertarian Catholic, as it is called the page, the magazine you are the editor of. Can you explain a little bit to the viewers what a libertarian Catholic is?
Sure. So it actually feeds off of what Charles was saying just now. The notion that in order to have liberty, you need a strong faith, and we believe at the Libertarian Catholic that Catholicism is necessary for liberty, and I think also you can flip it and say that in general, in order to have a strong faith, a true faith, you also need liberty or freedom. And so in a nutshell, that's basically what we set out to present in the Libertarian Catholic. And we do so by means of podcasts and essays along the lines of that. In terms of how that works in a practical sense, I would say it is very closely aligned with the original understanding of the United States, or the founding of the United States. So when we say libertarian, we don't mean libertine, for instance. And I don't know if it's possible to say libertine Catholic, right? So hopefully that's a clear stipulation in the name itself.
Will you leave the Kennedys out of this?
Good point. But yes, it's intentionally provocative, and but I think when you dig into it, it's also almost necessary to have the two juxtaposed as such.
Do you adhere to a particular brand of libertarianism, such as paleo-libertarianism, or any similar kind of thinking, which is more in line with the conservatism and, well, as a Catholic, social thinking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough to say. I would say personally, and I would say with the website as well, the philosophy is more broad, big tent libertarianism, based on the core principles of the non-aggression principle, but then also the principles behind the United States. So the fact that we are endowed with certain inalienable rights by our maker would be the central premise. So we in particular pieces, so paleo-libertarianism, anarcho-capitalism, that kind of thing, those are all, they all have value. I would say we just don't focus on the differences between each one of those, and just try to focus on the general principle.
All right. Well, I think there's a common ground for both traditional Catholic thinking and both this particular brand of Catholic libertarianism on the figure of monarchy. For libertarians, monarchy could be understood as the smallest government possible, because it is reduced to one person, the king. And for the Catholic thinking, it is a reflection of the way God works. God is king, and thus everything is subject to him. I would like to see how you play with this idea, how you get to understand it and to make it one according to different perspectives. I would like to begin with Eric, because he hasn't talked too much, and then we will go with Charles.
Very egalitarian. We have to even out the time here. So thank you. Yeah, so I would say you can look at monarchy in this different lights. This notion of minarchism, monarchy as minarchy, really is enticing to a libertarian, though I would say we typically don't see monarchy in that way. We see it basically in terms of it's authority vested into one person, and the result of that would be I guess the lack of authority in the individuals or the citizens of the country. So that's the thing that stands out when I think about monarchy, not necessarily the fact that it is a smaller government. Because I think as the United States attested early on, that it is very possible to have a almost minimal government for a nation state that's not monarchy.
All right, now with you, Charles.
Well, I agree with you and I don't, all at the same time.
Excellent.
Shows you I can come out of California. No, there are several things I'd point out. One is, and again, I emphasize that I'm an historian. I'm not really much of a theorist. And the fact is that the majority of Catholic monarchies over the long stretch of almost 1,500 years that they existed, there are only a couple left now, they worked pretty well most of the time. The only things that we remember over and over and over and over again are when they failed. But that's like judging the entirety of U.S. history by the Civil War. You know, if you compress it all to those 5 years, then this is the bloodiest country that ever existed. It's just an utter madhouse. Well, but that's not really the way you should look at American history. So that's a very important point to make, I think. Secondly, it's also important to bear in mind that, and again, most people aren't aware of this because the historical background isn't there, but even in the 13 colonies under George III, what's forgotten is that the king very often acted as the protector of minorities within the colonies against the dominant sets. And bear in mind, as with most revolutions, it was the dominant sets in each colony that brought you the revolution. That's why the 5 wealthiest men in 1776 in the colonies were Washington, John Hancock, Philip Schuyler, and Charles Carroll of Carrollton. And in point of fact, the colonial assemblies, which these men dominated, were the ones who levied almost all the taxes that the average individual paid, most of whom, of course, couldn't vote for it. That's why I've always found taxation without representation to be a little bit of special pleading, because the only ones who actually paid those taxes were the wealthiest people in the colonies. The thing is that I'm thinking now of 2 incidents a decade before the revolution broke out. In Massachusetts, remember I mentioned every colony had its own setup. Well, in Massachusetts, the state church was congregational, but that didn't mean quite what you might think. There was no central congregational setup. But the colonial law, the assembly, dominated by John Hancock and his like, required that every town pay for a congregational minister. And they had the same meeting house for townhouse and church. Well, it so happened that a group of Baptists who were kind of persecuted in Massachusetts alongside the Quakers, forget the Catholics who weren't even there, but the Quakers and the Baptists didn't have a good time in colonial Massachusetts. So the group of Baptists moved out to a town called Ashfield, which was then out in the back of beyond, still is really. I hope no one from Ashfield just heard that. But at any rate, they moved out there, and the assembly required them to pay for a congregational minister. And there were no congregationalists in the town. They were all Baptists. So they appealed to the king. And the king said, nope, you shouldn't have to pay for a congregational minister. Your church under your colonial charter have a Baptist if that's what you want. And the assembly, this is one of the things that led up to the revolution and did not make the king any more popular amongst the colonial leadership. I have to say too that I've got kind of a dog in this particular fight because I say the Quebec Act, which gave my ancestors the freedom to practice their religion and live under their own laws, and which is denounced in the Declaration of Independence in the most Orwellian terms you can imagine, where the king is attacked for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province. Those are the penal laws, you know, where priests would be hung and that kind of thing. So that came to an end in Quebec, and it was very much resented. But by a stroke of providence, I dare say, the only way that the rebellion could succeed was with French and Spanish aid. And because of France and Spain getting into the war, they, of course, couldn't very well persecute Catholics after they won, now could they? And that led to a huge opportunity, which America's Catholics flubbed. We had freedom of religion under the Constitution, freedom to evangelize, and we didn't do it. Just wanted to be respectable, get one of our own to be president. So the reason why I mention all this isn't simply to flex history. It's to make an important point, and that is the Catholic monarchy, as I've described it, was the result of an organic growth of what happened when various cultures were converted, became Catholic, and produced the sort of system I speak of. But the United States are very different. We were founded under very different principles, very different religious principles. And her political principles, her philosophical principles are reflections of that. To give you one little example, and then I'll release the floor, and I hope I've answered the question. If I haven't, make me clarify. But the Calvinism that was very strong in New England really became very much a part of the national bloodstream. But it also provoked a reaction, Unitarianism. The idea that it doesn't matter what you believe so long as you're a nice person, conduct over creed. And these two elements are in our national character, our national mentality. From the Calvinists, we get the idea, well, how do I put it? Calvinist peoples, not just ourselves, but the Afrikaners in South Africa, the Ulster Scots and so forth, they tend to radically identify with the children of Israel in the Old Testament. Their enemies are Canaanites. They've fled oppression under Pharaoh. They made the great Exodus. You can see where that would apply to our sort of salvation history. A lot of what we call American exceptionalism comes from that. But the idea of American exceptionalism, I don't mean to say that we aren't very different, we certainly are, but I mean to say the idea of being the shining city on the hill, the last best hope of mankind, that kind of stuff. Basically the successors to the children of Israel. With the Mormons, that's actually a dogma, just so you know. When Christ comes back, he's coming to Independence, Missouri. If you don't believe me, they'll tell you. So I'm not kidding. The other element of our nature, though, the Unitarian side, which again is a reaction to the Calvinists, religiously speaking, conduct over creed, niceness over belief. And in a sense, all of us Americans have a bit of this in our makeup, if you're born and raised in the States, because it's in everything we do. It's in everything we say. You know, I don't care what someone is as long as he's a good American. President Eisenhower put it best when he was inaugurated. His parents were Jehovah's Witnesses, so he had really been raised without any kind of a particular religion. But he knew that a country has to have one. And he made a very famous comment around the time he was inaugurated. And to explain why he had been baptized just then a Presbyterian, and joined the Presbyterian Church. He said, "Our system makes absolutely no sense unless it has a firm basis in religion. And I don't care what it is. What the religion is, I mean, not the basis." And that kind of epitomizes what I call the Unitarian aspect. But fast forward to the present, You may recall that we've had several fights in the courts over things like under God and the Pledge of Allegiance and that kind of thing. Well, I forget the name of the justice who came up with this phrase, but it's interesting and very telling as to where we are now and how far we've come. She made the point that, I remember it was a she made the point that all these things like the pledge and so forth are a ceremonial deism, which do not interfere with the anti-establishment clause of the Constitution, because in essence, they're meaningless. That, I would say, was the result of the course our history took.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to go to a more economic argument, because the history of all of it, it's very it's dense, and for another perspective on monarchism in the U.S., a historical argument is a very deep argument to support it. But I want to hear the economic argument from Eric. I think you know about this one. Hans Hermann Hoppe says that monarchs protect the property rights way better than do democracies. I would like to explain to the viewers and to us, and to add a little bit of your own thinking into that particular argument.
Sure. So who is it that said that?
Hans Hermann Hoppe. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I would say in some ways, obviously, it makes sense to have the sovereign basically dictating and protecting property rights, or have someone that is in charge of that. But I think it just comes back to this notion that the sovereignty of, let me put it in other terms. Was it Hobbes that said, if you have the power to protect everyone, you have the power to control everyone, or something to that effect? Basically, if you give someone the power to protect your property, they will still have the same power to tyrannize over you. So it comes back to this notion that it is the individual that has the best, I guess, sovereignty over their own property, and they have the best ability to protect their own property.
If I can make a point there, it seems to me though that the problem is that the individual in real life never does have the ability to protect his property all by himself. Hobbes, of course, Hobbes, you know, he was a great apologist for Cromwell and all that, and I understood what was going on with him. I get that. You know, he had his interests, you know, same as they all did. But it's interesting to me, and using now our common law, you know that under the common law there are two kinds of ownership of land: feudal and allodial. Now, allodial means you're the supreme lord of the land. The allod is a phrase you don't hear every day. You can throw it around now at parties; people will be impressed or not. Right. The other, feudal, means yes, you own your property, but you own it under the supreme lord of the land, whoever that might be. Now, it was that concept that gave us what's called eminent domain. Now, in Britain and the Commonwealth, and I have to restrict myself to that because it's strictly under the common law that they and we share. Under the common law, while you were, practically speaking, you're the owner of your property, an Englishman's home is his castle. If the king felt that the public good required your property for a road or a fort or a lighthouse or anything like that, then upon payment of proper compensation, because your home is your castle, so he's got to give you something, you know, something else, then he could take it and build the castle or the road or whatever. Now, interestingly enough to me, anyway, we inherited the same idea in our law, although it has never been determined whether land ownership in the United States are under feudal or lodial ownership. And that's for a very important reason. Because if you said we're a lodial, then you couldn't have eminent domain. If you said we're feudal, that's nice. Who's the lord of the land? You can't answer that question, neither can I. The fun part in all this, though, is that eminent domain, which remains what I've pretty much said in Britain and Canada and the rest of the common law countries, with us, under our free system, has expanded. So that although there's no lord of the land, in the 50s, during the era of urban renewal, the Supreme Court, the real lords of us all, the Supreme Court ruled that cities could take as blighted areas any sections they felt needed to be renewed. And the result, of course, was horrendous, but that's beside the point. In our own time, 10 years ago, Lino versus New London, it was ruled that eminent domain could extend to simply taking your property from you if they could find someone who could pay higher taxes on it than you can. Now, this completely overthrows the entire concept of the landowning citizen. And it's now the law of the land. Under our free system, you wouldn't be able to get away with it in Britain or the Commonwealth, because an Englishman's home is his castle.
So I agree completely. We've kind of swayed away from the original concept of property ownership, but that doesn't necessarily mean that libertarianism is responsible for that, or liberty is responsible for that.
Well, here I make a distinction. You can't hold libertarianism accountable for anything because it's never ruled anywhere. So I certainly wouldn't hold liberty. You got to bear in mind, this is what I mean. I'm not an abstract thinker. I can only go on what's been. I can't go on some. I love Ray Bradbury, but I will not comment on Martian affairs. Okay, I don't know what it's like up there. I've never been. I don't know. I'm all for it. Don't get me wrong. God bless them. But no, I don't hold libertarianism accountable for anything. What I do hold accountable for the way our system has worked out is the fact that not having a shared religious basis, not having a shared organic unity, not having an effective source of authority, the electorate, well, we have gone the way we've gone for very understandable reasons. You know, it's not like people were sitting in a dark room and decided it was going to go this way. It went this way because this is the way it works when you don't really have a focus of unity and authority that everyone accepts, that's effective. Because again, I would contrast, as I did before, the medieval/Catholic idea: authority is concentrated, power is diffuse. What has killed our system is that authority is diffuse in the electorate, which means it doesn't really count for anything. And power has become concentrated, especially in the judiciary, in the media, and so on.
For sure.
And that's a very good point, because most of the libertarian thinkers, they want to diffuse the power that the government has been reclaiming for itself for the last, for the last 2-3 centuries. And that's the central idea of libertarianism, to make the government as small as possible, and for it to make it not important for any kind of protection of property rights, nor the intrusion and the coercion of liberty rights.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Go on.
Well, I was just going to remark based on what Charles was saying, just to reiterate the notion that when I say libertarianism, I don't mean the untried near anarchy state that we would probably prefer in the libertarian Catholic. The libertarianism that I would refer to is the classical liberalism of the founders, and yes, it's probably true that hasn't really been tried either, and it's more of an idea. It's a big picture idea. You might say it's only abstract, right? But that's the principle that drove the foundation of the country, and probably for the first 100 years, the policies that came from it.
Right. There's another argument I think that can work for both the traditional and the libertarian brand of thinking. Both Carl Schmitt, the German legal thinker, and Justice Antonin Scalia, the Supreme Court justice, saw the executive branch of government as some kind of elective monarchy in which the president or the executive leader could act as the sovereign. Both in the United States and in other legal traditions, this has been received with some kind of controversy and criticism, because in a sense, it destroys the concept of a separation of powers that is central to the US Constitution. So I would like the both of you to comment on this particular topic.
I'll defer to Charles to begin that.
All right.
Oh, thanks. Thanks a lot. I'll do you a favor someday. All right, fine. No, seriously, I have to say that, again, falling back on history, there's a recent book, which I recommend highly to you, by a fellow called Eric Nelson, Harvard University Press. I don't generally recommend Harvard stuff, but it's a good book. It's called The Royalist Revolution. And it points out the fact that in the beginning of the pamphlet war, a lot of the founding fathers couched their arguments. Remember that it was not actually the king who made the colonial decisions. It was the government and parliament. And that's why, incidentally, they attacked the king in the Declaration of Independence, because if they attacked parliament, it would kind of undo the Lockean basis of the Declaration. So, I mean, it was a clever propaganda move, but it really wasn't what you would call accurate. The truth is that it was Parliament and the ministry that made those decisions. Now, when the things began to heat up, various of the would-be revolutionaries began appealing to the king directly to rule the colonies without Parliament. The reason being that most of them had been founded under Charles I or Charles II or James I. And there was no mention in their colonial charters of the Parliament having any authority over them at all. So that was the fallback position. Well, we're not subject to Parliament, we're only subject to the king. And this entered later on, this idea would enter into the constitutional deliberations in Philadelphia. And Nelson ends the book with a very interesting observation, which I think is quite true. And that is, he said, and bear in mind that the revolution did a lot of damage to George III's standing in Britain itself. It's why, for want of a better way to put it, it's why General Howe threw the war in the first part of the fighting. He was a Whig, you see, and when he retired, he went back to London and became part of the Whig opposition. Anyway, it was simply this: that when the war was over and the Constitution was done and all that, on one side of the Atlantic, you had a king without a monarchy, and on the other, a monarchy without a king. And that, I think, is a fairly just way to look at it, because the American presidency is indeed a sort of monarch, only he's not. His office is based upon the way they thought the British monarchy functioned, which it didn't quite that way, but nevertheless, it was in their minds. I think that, as I said earlier, if one had an hereditary king with just the powers that the president has, number one, I doubt, because he's hereditary, anybody would let him get one iota beyond what was given him in the Constitution, which has not been true with our presidents, believe it or not. I don't want to shock anyone, but some of our presidents have gone beyond their constitutional powers. True. I know what you're saying. Impossible, but trust me on this one. Anyway, but believe me, if there was a king instead of a president, you'd have all the eagle eyes out. But because we can vote for him, the assumption is, oh well, it really is okay. But the second problem inherent to that is that any president is really only the leader of his party. And as we know, he spends half his time trying to learn his job and the other half trying to get reelected. These are all problems. Now, there have been presidents, I will be the first to admit, who have to some degree overcome these limitations. And God knows that in times of deep conflict in our country, the people sort of create a quasi-daddy figure. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking here of Abraham Lincoln, I'm thinking of Franklin Roosevelt, I'm even thinking to a degree of Ronald Reagan, all of whom were idolized in their time. Mm-hmm. JFK, believe it or not, was more idolized afterwards as, our martyred president, that kind of stuff. But I mention all this because I believe that Scalia is right in a sense. The problem is that the presidency as it's constituted, how do I say this? I don't believe he can adequately, that any elected official for 8 years can adequately play the role of a monarch. And I do not believe that our constitutional system could stand the stress of trying to implant such a setup. I mean, you got to bear in mind, our system arose through a very peculiar and unusual set of circumstances, and it was sustained equally by them. That's why we've got such problems now, because they're falling to pieces around us. These are the things that allowed it to continue. One of the other issues that confronts anyone who would look for any alternative to what we have is, how do you get from here to there? How do you bail the cat? How are you going to do that? It's true for libertarians. It's true for distributists. It's true for constitutionalists. And to a constitutionalist, I would have to say, all right, you want to restore the Constitution. Sounds fair. Which one? The one of my childhood? The one before FDR? The one before Woodrow Wilson? The one before Appomattox? The one before the Louisiana Purchase? Or perhaps the one before Washington appointed a cabinet? Which, after all, there's no requirement for a cabinet there's no mention of a cabinet in the Constitution. None. So, when people say they're strict constructionists, I'll say, well, all right, but how strict do you want to be? How far back are we going to go? And again, I throw these questions out not simply to be amusing, although I don't mind it if I can manage it, but to point out that you're aiming at a target that's constantly moving. And for myself, I would say, I don't pretend to have a how-to method to transform American government, simply because I believe that American government, good, bad, or indifferent, really is, in a true sense, an expression of the national ideal. The problem is the national ideal at the moment is not in a very good way. And I believe that this is precisely because, I'm going to be radical, I know, it's precisely because we American Catholics failed in the 200 years that Constitution gave us the freedom to operate. We failed to evangelize, and so, in a very real sense, we betrayed our country.
And now we lose the ability to even worship the way we ought.
Exactly. We pay the price. This is the payback, you might say. It's not.
All right.
You see, this is the problem with history. You can't the Catholic cannot just sit there pretty. We evangelize or we fall in on ourselves. We save souls or we get smacked around. Sometimes we get smacked around for saving souls, but those are smacked around for the right reason. Now we'll just be smacked around because we're there to smack.
To follow up on that, on the presidency. I think Scalia's he's right, and as he always is, pretty much. But I think to answer Charles's question, which constitution, Scalia would go back to the original, right? The one before the living document scholars came through and it kind of changed the way it was viewed. But I do think that today, especially, we're getting more to the point of where the president is a monarch, and it's less in terms of the good kind of monarch that Charles idealizes, but and more toward the more tyrannical type of monarch that libertarians would consider as the bugbear. You look at the kind of fervor that the elections take here, and I don't know if it's visible in South America or Europe as much as it is here, but everyone pretty much on both sides of the whole spectrum saying that the political, this election, the presidential election, is life and death. And basically, if the other person gets elected, everything is going to change and it's going to be terrible. And you think about the president, probably for the last maybe 20, 25 years, he uses his State of the Union to lay out his plan for new laws. And he's basically asking Congress to write these laws so that he can pass it. And the only thing that's wrong with that is that it's not in his duty to write the laws, right?
No.
So he's overtaking the duty of the Congress, and I think that is the way in which him being more of a monarch, more of a I guess an authority, is really detrimental to the way that the United States functions.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And of course, he doesn't have any of the restrictions that Henry VIII had.
Okay.
He can do anything he wants. I mean, Henry VIII, you know, he could knock off some of his wives, but he could only have one at once, and he couldn't marry her brother either. But the thing is that now, if you take between them the presidency and particularly the judiciary in particular, it's absolute control.
Yeah.
And my personal feeling, and I'm not just using this to score a point, and if I were, I don't know who I'd be scoring it against, neither of you two, that's for sure. But I thought it very interesting the way Mr. Trump has handled the current crisis, both the disease and the unrest, in that he actually has abided by the Constitution, which, mind you, I think there's primary reason for doing it is political, in the sense that since he's funding everything, it gives him the ability to claim credit if everything goes right, and the ability to say, well, it's your governor if it all goes into a mess. Now, whether President Trump will remain that way if he's reelected, you see, that's where you always find out what a president really is like. You have no idea the first term what it's like. It's the second term. When he no longer faces reelection, you get to meet the man. That's why we found out the real Obama the second term, the real Mr. Bush Jr. the second term.
Mm-hmm.
We never got to know the real Mr. Bush Sr. You live with what you got. We sure found Mr. Clinton all right. So I mention all this because Americans have the tendency to replace religion with politics. And they have the fervor for them. And again, this goes back to conduct over creed, because that basic human impulse has to go somewhere. And with us, since we can't go into religion, that would be impolite. It goes into politics. And now that things are so insane, let me just say that every historical event is the result of a lot of different things, very often not causally connected, coming together. Take one out and it wouldn't work that way. So we have several different chickens coming home to roost right now. But it leaves us with several rather unpleasant questions. I tell you, my answer to the thing is that Catholics have to work to convert the country. That's the only solution I see. And it's a real long-term solution. But, you know, we did Rome in 300 years. Maybe we can do America if we ever get our minds set to it, really get into it, saving souls, thinking hell's bad, you know, that kind of thing. If we ever get that way, then maybe in 3 centuries we'll have an order in this, well, whatever is here by that time, that's worth writing home about. In the immediate, politically, well, I'll make a couple of predictions here that I hope I'm wrong about. And I hope that in 10 years' time, on my 70th birthday, you can both tell me how stupid I was and how wrong I was. And I will pray thankfully to God that you were right and I was wrong. But my suspicion is, firstly, you said earlier that both sides are sure that if the other man wins, everything will be changed and it'll be a disaster. I'm sure they're both right. I bipartisan, you bet. I'm absolutely sure they're both right, but of course for different reasons.
Right.
Different reasons. If Mr. Trump is reelected, which personally I suspect is going to happen, not only happen, but I think you'll have rather more of a landslide than anybody's expecting, simply because the people had reasons to lie to pollsters in 2016. Now, ever so much more. And being old enough to remember the long, hot summer of '67, which propelled Mr. Nixon to the White House, I can tell you that usually Americans vote Republican when they're afraid. It's just the way it is. I don't say it's wise, I say it's the way they are. Anyway, if he gets in, then I suspect that he'll put down the civil unrest pretty quickly. And in 4 years, over the next 4 years, we'll find out what he's really all about, which may be good, which may be bad. I can't predict it. I don't know. But we'll find out in either case. The problem is that 4 years after, I don't see him as breeding a successor. And so unless the Democrats have suddenly become very different to what they are right now, which they didn't over the last 4 years, that will bring us back to where we are at the moment. And so if Mrs. Harris is elected as president, then I suspect you will have a blowback to what's going on, and it won't be pretty. Not pretty at all.
Well, it's fascinating. I just recalled that in 2016, Trump actually ran on a law and order bit. It wasn't as pronounced as it is now, but he said that when he gets elected, he will bring back law and order, and that just brings up this fascinating point that it seems like every 4 years there's a lot more unrest. For some reason, more protests, and strangely enough, and there's cycles. And I think after that period, after the election, there was a period of about 3 years where it was generally quiet along that front. And now we're back with unrest, probably unrest that we haven't seen since the 60s. But here we go. And so it's, I don't know, maybe if he gets elected again, we'll see the same cycle go through.
We might. I mean, you know, hope for the best and expect the worst, and you'll never be disappointed. But it's hard. It's hard to say. It's interesting though, and you might find this particularly interesting as a maven of political theory, that probably the most creative time in our history, as far as political theories went, was the Great Depression. When the system seemed as though we're on the very brink of collapse, you had every imaginable idea possible out there. I mean, some of them were obviously crazy. A lot of them weren't, but it was amazing. I mean, everything from social credit, technocracy, the Catholic worker arose then. It was a very fertile time for political thought, because you see, the truth of the matter is that people are generally very content when things aren't bad. I know what you're thinking. It's strange, but good times, people aren't interested in changing the system. They just leave me alone.
Stay the course.
But, I mean, what the vast majority of people at any given time are conservative with a small c. As long as you don't beat them or starve them, they'll get along, and they want to be left alone. They don't want to be pushed and pulled. It's interesting to me, for instance, you take, again, the 13 colonies and the revolution. Now, an area that you might very well study, which you might find of great interest, is the makeup of the Loyalists. Very interesting crowd. And in the old books, of course, oh, well, they were all the rich. Not at all. They were extremely diverse, which is partly their weakness. Every counter-revolution has that problem, is the diversity. Because all that really unites them is they don't like the revolutionaries. Yeah. But in this particular case, remember what I said earlier about the people who ran the assemblies being the ones who brought you the revolution. Well, the areas of each colony that was sort of neglected, on the fringe, left out, however you want to call it, they tended to be loyalist. Now, that was where a lot of the loyalist troops were raised, for obvious reasons, because the people who had been running their lives up to that point were now saying, join us in this glorious crusade against the king. You know, I don't think I want to do that. You tax me and you smack me around. And why don't you send your own sons and leave me out of it? So that, and then of course, when pushed, they joined the loyalist troops. All right, fast forward, the 1860, the 13 original states. Interesting factoid. The areas in the northern states, those 13, well, 6 or whatever, northern states that had been the original colonies, those areas that had been loyalist tended to be Copperhead. That is, they opposed fighting to keep the South in the Union. But in the South, those areas that had been loyalist tended to be Unionist. That is, they opposed secession. And you might say, well, gee, I don't understand. They were united in the revolution, because it's not what it was about. What it was about was that just as the revolution for them were their everyday oppressors, asked them to go to war against the one man they could look to above all that. Sure. Now, in the North, come and join us in our glorious fight to save the Union. Or in the South, come and join us in our glorious fight for states' rights. But in both cases, I don't think I like that idea. You smack me around normally, you run the show, and now you want me to die for you? I don't like that.
Right.
It's a fascinating thing to look at and study in detail, I assure you.
I think we have to go to the question and answer section, because there are quite a lot of questions that both of you can answer.
Oh.
All right. I think I'll go with the last one. It is by San Cosmas, a very Catholic guy, I think. As some debate, do you guys see America breaking apart? If yes, do you think they could become monarchies or republics? All right.
Do you want to answer that first?
I'll throw out some speculation. So because there's been a lot of talk lately about civil war, and I think and it makes sense based on the fact that there are such solid divisions within the United States and pretty much against party lines, so that each side of this big debate agrees pretty wholeheartedly with everyone else with all of the ideas on that side. The problem with the idea of civil war, if it were practically considered, is that the people who are divided are neighbors to one another. And we can consider back to the American Civil War when this actually took place. It was states, and it was really divided evenly, and with a clean border, which made secession a lot easier, and therefore the Civil War stemmed much easier from that. If the parties involved today decided that Civil War was the best solution for this, it would be, I don't think there would be a clear way to engage in that. It would be a lot of chaos. Now there is some uniformity or some design, some layout to the red states versus the blue states, but even there you have some blue states within a crowd of red states and some dispersion then within. If there were a big exodus, like say for instance after the India's independence, where the Muslims all went to the north, I could see that being a possibility. But if that were to happen, it would be probably as disastrous as that separation was. So as far as prospects go, speculating here completely, it doesn't look good. And I hope that we can figure out a way to not do that, not split up.
All right.
Amen.
It's your turn, Charles.
Well, all right. Well, one thing I would like to point out, though, I mean, just an historical note, it actually was, the Civil War was not quite as cut and dried as you might think. Southern Jersey, for instance, was all Copperhead, and God help the Union recruiting officer who went down in the Pine Barrens because he wouldn't come back. And similarly, West Virginia seceded from Virginia. You remember the Hatfield-McCoy dispute?
Sure, yeah.
One family had been Union, the other had been Confederate. That was the start of the feud. In places like Arkansas, Louisiana, Eastern Tennessee, where Andrew Johnson was from, heavy Union pockets, just as there were heavy Copperhead pockets in the North. Again, if they were old enough, they had been Loyalist areas during the Revolution. It's not the side of. Remember that the Civil War was brought to you by the Union and the Confederacy, so a lot of stories, shall we say, got left out. But at any rate, but you're quite right in that a division. If you really want to know where the boundaries lie, look at a ward map of the 2016 election, and you'll see that it does cut through every state in this union. Usually the older urban areas tend to be blue. Everything else is red. And you've got problems with that because even the nature of the people on each side is very, very different. The Reds, if we're going to call them that, they're the people who actually make things happen, make things work in terms of feeding people and, keeping factories working and stuff like that. The Blues are heavily done in terms of people who are either, shall we say, in need of assistance, or contrary-wise, are people like you and me, media people, academics, etc. And mind you, we're very pleasant, nice to have at parties and good for shows, but you really can't use us as the basis of anything productive. I mean, it's not in us. I hate to be honest, but I mean, if you wanted me to run a tractor factory, we'd go broke. So there is both a geographical difference and a difference in the kind of people involved. The problem, of course, is that the head is much, much bluer than the body. Mutatis mutandis, Frank Berger, who's an American sociologist, made a comment which I think would shed a little bit of light onto where these divisions lie. He made the comment that the Swedes are the least religious people on earth and the Indians are the most. The United States, he said, are a nation of Indians ruled by Swedes. Or to put this another way, a nation of rednecks ruled by Chardonnay slaves. That's who we are. Now, that any kind of civil war in that setup is not going to be pretty. There's no way it can end nicely. Because without the head, what does the body do? And without the body, what's the head? So I think it's quite possible that we'll have a civil war, but I think it won't be pretty. I think in a lot of places it won't even be coherent.
Agreed.
And what I suspect would come out of it, frankly, is not necessarily division, but a strong man, a man on the white horse. And that guy, whoever and whatever he is, everything will then become dependent on his personality, to the degree that he's good, to the degree that he's bad, to the degree that he's nuts, to the degree that he's sane. I have no idea. All I can say is that he's interested in gardening, and I'm going to spend a lot of time with our roses and tulips, more than we ever did before. Man, I love working in the soil.
It's a good release, I'm sure. One point on that, if I might add, it seems like liberalism or libertarianism has a solution to avoid any kind of civil war. I think the real problem now is that everyone sees the differences as absolutely life or death. And the only reason they see these differences as life or death is because they think that what the other person does is going to affect them. And the original intent of liberalism or libertarianism is to suggest that what the other person does is his business. And you can live next to someone who doesn't agree with you as long as all of your tax money isn't going to fund him, or all of your regulations that he implies is going to affect you. So I think if we can look at it in this way, the real solution to avoiding a civil war is to scale back the statism that has taken over and get back to a more libertarian structure, I guess.
You know the big problem with that, however?
What's that?
Well, again, I hate to bring in the here and now. I hate it, but I will. Entitlements,
Oh, yeah.
all the good stuff that everybody gets. Nobody wants to give up their goodies.
Oh, yeah.
You're suggesting they shoot Santa Claus.
Agreed. And I would say it is the only solution to scale back the statism. I don't know if it's possible, but we can.
Therein lies
hope.
Therein lies the problem. You remember Aesop's fable, Who'll Bell the Cat?
I don't think so. Can you?
Sure. Short version.
Yeah.
No, a really long one, but I'll give you the short version.
Sure.
Basically, the mice began to notice that the cat was nicking them and eating them. And they didn't really approve very much of this going on. So they had a big meeting of all the mice, and they agreed that this was bad and that the cat probably shouldn't be doing it. They also realized that the cat probably would not agree with them. So how to stop him? Even if they mobbed him, they wouldn't be able to do anything because they're mice. Were they going to bite him? So they came up with a brilliant idea. What they needed to do was take a bell and tie it around the cat's tail. And that way, every time he was creeping up on them, they'd hear the bell ring and know to scamper. This was a great idea. And all the mice voted yes. They were absolutely unanimous. The cat must be belled right now. Then the next question, who's going to do it? And all the mice looked at one another. And one by one, they went off to their holes because, of course, no one's going to bail the cat.
Right.
And I mean, don't get me wrong. I love social theory as much as any other dilettante in the topic, in the subject. But I fear that the problem with libertarianism, as you describe it, is twofold. One is the practical, i.e., how do we get from here to there? And that's a question you could ask of anything other than let's keep what we've got. You know, that's the easy answer is let's just keep going doing what we're doing and everything will be right. Or not. The second problem, though, is that I don't think that on the long run it can really work, because the idea that everyone's going to do their own thing in perfect freedom and equality, it just never happens. In human societies, you will always have the rulers and the ruled. And the problem when you try to pretend, as we have for 200 years, that you don't, is that the rulers become totally irresponsible. They're not answerable to God. They're not answerable to tradition. They're not answerable to anything except the will of the people. And the will of the people, well, that can be whatever you like it to be, especially if you can get them to vote themselves other people's money. Can I reveal a terrible secret?
Sure.
Go on.
Whenever there's a bond issue, I always vote no. The reason is because I don't own any property. And for me to vote yes to a bond issue would be to apportion those who do own property and pay taxes on it. It would be my apportioning their tax money. Now, see that, to me, I'm an old man, you know, we have weird ideas. That's called theft. And I mean, this is even the case if it's something like libraries that I'm all for. You know, I agree with the late lamented Ray Bradbury. Close the universities and open more libraries. Let those who want to learn, and those who don't, well. But seriously, we have trained up generations in our country to be dependent. You're not going to change that overnight. In fact, why would you change it? How could you change it? Now, again, I'm saying under the current setup. I come back to conversion because I tell you, the problem our country has always had is a religious one. It was built upon foundations that were not sturdy, and they are breaking around us now. And believe me, it doesn't bring me any joy to say that. I served in the National Guard. I love the United States more than I can say. I've been in every single one of the 50. You know, my little joke is that if you want to hate the United States, study our foreign policy. That's history. If you want to love the United States, travel.
Mm-hmm.
Meet people, see places, do things, see where the history was made, even if you don't like it. Even if your side didn't win that battle, whichever your side was, look at it, get a feeling for it. Because good or bad, our history is what made us what we are. And what we are, we have problems, but you know, we invented the cocktail. Nobody else did that. The Broadway musical and the polio vaccine. We did all that stuff. That is the real America, you see. The America that always had the enterprise to do things. Maybe at a price of thinking, but still, we did a lot of really neat things. We didn't make the Mona Lisa. We didn't produce Shakespeare, but we did produce Washington Irving and American Gothic. So
there's our last question. I think that we can close the interview with this. And the question is, it's very, very. How do I say this? It's meant to close the thing. So it's by Code Films. Monarchism or libertarianism? Why not both a la Liechtenstein? I hope I can. Oh no, I can. Yeah.
Monarchism or libertarianism? Why not both a la Liechtenstein? Well, I don't know. Why not? You'd have to have a prince like the Prince of Liechtenstein. But have you read Eric? Have you read Hoppe, Democracy, the God That Failed?
Not so much.
Yeah.
No.
Well, I would recommend him simply because he's a monarchist. He deals with it from a libertarian perspective. And I think you might find it very interesting, if nothing else. But
yeah, I love it.
The main argument for a Liechtensteinian monarchy to work, for a libertarian monarchy to work, is to have a very small territory and to have a very small population. The more the population it gets, the more territory you gain. You have a lot of problems to have the administration of it. How you can govern so much people? How can you control so much territory?
Eric von Kühler-Ledeen made a great comment that if Europe was made up entirely of Luxembourgs, Liechtensteins, and Monacos, her history would have been a lot happier. But the thing too about Liechtenstein that don't forget is that it is a small country. It does have very few people. They have only one religion among them, and they're all Catholic. It has, I think, every day of obligation is a national holiday. So they've got like 30 holidays. And it's a very well-run place, but it's a little bit like to my way of thinking, and I'll give up the floor in a microsecond, but it's a little bit like trying to compare the Austrian health system to the American. You know, here in Austria, we have quote-unquote socialized medicine, but it's for each state. Each state is very small. They have a lot of people and they have a lot of money because the people are very rich and they're willing to pay huge taxes to sustain the thing. And it works. But it works because it's very small scale and you've got a lot of well-to-do people paying into it. You could not, by any stretch of the imagination, import a system like that to the United States. You just, you couldn't. I mean, you would end up with Beverly Hills supporting all the medical practices in Los Angeles County. And trust me, they're not going to do that. And they have the pull.
Well, if I could speak to that, I think you're right. And the one thing, both of you all are right, and especially so, Ugo, you mentioned there's just too much. The United States is just too big to handle anything as I guess specific and particular as a Liechtenstein. But the idea of libertarianism again has a solution, and Catholicism has a solution in subsidiarity. And if we scale back the nationalism, the statism that we've produced, and get back to maybe the original federalism, you start to see smaller pockets of centralized authority, basically decentralized authority, that does get you closer to something like a Liechtenstein. And obviously I guess the detriment to that would be the fact that you don't have this superpower, which is the United States, and the limitations that provides. But I think whether we want to or not, I think we're heading in that direction. And recent events here in the United States, especially the coronavirus lockdown, and then the uprisings in these cities, it's going to lead to a situation where people do want to decentralize. They're leaving big cities. New York City has been shown to basically they're just hemorrhaging people, and they go to their preferred cities, and sometimes it's a large city in itself. But I think that trend is going to continue throughout, to the effect that we get a kind of de-urbanization that we saw maybe even similar to that which was at the end of the Roman Empire. And who knows? I mean, it could be at a certain point in 100 years, the United States is a network of Liechtensteins based on that demographic shift.
Well, it could work for the United States, it could work. I don't think for the rest of the countries. For example, both in Europe and in Hispanic America, we have certainly small countries like mine, but there's not as small as Liechtenstein to work. Indeed, there are coming elections in the next months, and we have like 24 candidates for the office of president. We have 24 candidates, and well, for me, it would work. For me, it would be way better to have a monarchy in here, because I think they would manage property rights way better, because they care about their property of the state itself. We wouldn't have to vote for 24 different people for the same office. In the U.S., at least you get only two candidates. I get to vote for 24 of them.
We get to vote for two candidates, but if we've got the setup we have now, we only have two, but they're loggerheads. And then in better times, you only have two, but they say the same thing. So, you can choose either one, you get whatever, you're given. I would say too, though, there's another point to consider, and that in terms of where we're going and so on. As I mentioned, I've finished the life of Blessed Emperor Karl. It's interesting to me that he's very popular in the United States. He has 14, soon to be 15 shrines across the country. And one of the things I dealt with in the book, not that this is a plug, one of the things I dealt with is why he would be popular in a country with whom he had been at war. And my suspicion is twofold. One, in a way, the United States are the world's longest living and far most successful Oedipus complex. We got rid of Daddy a long time ago. And Kaiser Karl, Emperor Charles, is the image of a man, which was what was expected of royals. They think of Charles I and Louis XVI and all that. A royal in those days was supposed to be ready to sacrifice his life for his people. And certainly Blessed Emperor Karl was, and he did. On his deathbed, he frequently said, I am suffering so that my peoples may come back together. Now, this is a kind of sacrificial leadership that was the ideal under Catholic monarchy. I'm not going to say they all achieved it, but that was the ideal. We don't have anything like that as the ideal. The idea of a president who would die for his country, except maybe Washington and Lincoln and Davis for our southern friends, impossible. Impossible. Presidents are people who send you to die at a great distance. They're not people who lead you into battle. Yeah. And it's a kind of leadership that we have absolutely no concept of, but on a deep, I think, psychological level, we do respond to it, which I suspect is the reason for his popularity in the United States. I'd love to have someone like him at our helm, but you can't just produce people like that. They're the result of tradition, of religion, of centuries of creation. And you can't just, nothing used to make me giggle more hysterically than hearing the Kennedys called America's royal family. Well, okay. All right, I don't know what to say about that. But seriously, and one does get serious occasionally. I think we can all agree on the fact that without the faith, one way or the other, the political order will not, and I don't think can, of itself, right itself. I don't think, it doesn't, in a certain sense, on a limited sense, it does matter, of course, but in a certain sense, it doesn't matter who you vote for if all you're going to get is more of the same. And I do think, speaking to something that both Eric and Hugo said, which I think has to be pointed out, one of the defects of the way things are done right now in the States is that the media force our attention constantly onto the national fame, always. So we neglect not just the state, where our voice doesn't count for that much, but the county, where it counts for a lot more. and the town, where it counts for a lot. If you live in a suburb of a major city, as I do in California, most people don't even know the names of their mayors or the city councilmen. They don't know. Because they're bedroom communities. They think, I live in San Antonio. Well, actually, you don't. You live in Bay Ridge or whatever it might be called. And you don't know who the mayor of Bay Ridge is. You don't know who the city council are. You never voted in a municipal election. You've got no idea about anything.
Sure.
That is something that if we learn nothing else from this, that has to stop. Americans have to begin to look at the local area again. And I think I can say that whether you're a libertarian or a monarchist or an integralist or a constitutionalist, I don't think anyone could really disagree with that. And I think that the woeful neglect of local politics is one of the major factors in the horrors that we're seeing across the country right now.
Yeah. I see a hat. Maybe it's a red hat. Make America local again.
I'd make it purple, for blue and red.
Yeah, good idea.
Oh, it would work. Well, it's been such a pleasure, you guys. The debate was a little bit one-sided because Charles know really a lot. I didn't expect Charles to know that much. I expected to be a little bit more of a debate, but I think it was more of a lecture with me and Eric commenting from time to time. Well, it's been great, actually. I think that actually the traditional vision is very close to libertarianism, except that libertarianism doesn't get to consider tradition too much. So I think that we can begin to look on that as a duty to us libertarians to begin to incorporate tradition a little bit more into our thinking.
Well,
so these are my last perspectives on this topic as a whole.
I would just say that every system not needs but has an animating philosophy, a state church, if you will. With the communists, with the Soviet Union, it was communism. There is no God and Lenin is his prophet. That was the state church of the Soviet Union, and it functioned like a religion. It played the role of the altar. It legitimated authority. It set the ground rules. We have one in America that's very, very vague, but it exists. We pretend it doesn't, and so it becomes intolerable. The more you try to pretend that things aren't, the worse they become. Your rulership we don't have a ruling class, everyone's equal. Great, it means your masters rule you completely and you don't even know. Similarly, the tenets of the American faith, such as it is, they're very vague, but if you step out of line, you'll be smacked around. And I think for a libertarian style system to work, it needs a very explicit animating principle, a state church, if you will. The place of tradition will go, as you said. Otherwise, you're stuck with the same problem we've had in the States down to the present. You'll have a state church, but you won't know what it is. And you won't know until you cross the line what it's like to be a heretic.
And we're seeing it with the cancel culture and with the more radical progressives are becoming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's
thank you again. Thank you very much, both Eric and Charles. It's been great. It's been a very productive and thoughtful debate and lecture for the case of Charles, for both of us. I'm very proud of how this turned out because it was a very difficult topic to talk about. So thank you, the two of you again.
Oh.
Thank you so much for putting this together. And I think just to reiterate, I think it sounds like we share more than we diverge. So it's really good to have this discussion.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you then. All right.
Yeah.